you like audiobooks or audio shows, check out a free trial of Audible. Just click the link in the description.
Welcome to MINDSHOCK. This is the Mothman series, part 6. UFOs. Unidentified flying objects. Regarding the Mothman phenomenon in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, 1966 to 1967. This is your host, Bruce McGuire. On the previous episode, we went deep into the Men in Black, supposed government agents responding to UFO or alien sightings. The theory is they want to keep it all under wraps. But John Keele wasn't so sure that all these Men in Black were actually from the U.S. government. There's plenty of theories abound. In this episode, we will take a look at UFOs. One of the most overlooked aspects of the Point Pleasant Mothman accounts are the dozens and dozens of UFO sightings, both before, during, and after the 13-month span of Mothman activity. John Keele, ufologist and paranormal researcher, has chronicled this aspect extremely well in his book, The Mothman Prophecies, published in 1975. Although an absolute, definitive, and direct link between UFOs and the Mothman was never established, other than one sighting which featured the Mothman being taken into a UFO, which I covered in Part 4, 13 Months of Fear. However, it is undeniable that the sheer number of UFO sightings, with witnesses even communicating with the UFOs via flashlight and getting responses, plays a major role in this baffling paranormal case. John Keele himself has witnessed extensive UFO activity in Point Pleasant and throughout the Ohio Valley. Journalist Mary Hyre was also present. The Men in Black have also been extensively involved, and that was covered in the previous episode. So we'll focus primarily on the UFO sightings and the nature of the UFO encounters. John Keele was center stage for much of the UFO phenomenon in West Virginia, but his research spans decades. He is often heralded as one of the top ufologists ever. From his book, he describes a meeting with a high-ranking officer at the Pentagon. In room 4C922 of the Pentagon building in 1966, there was an L-shaped cubicle occupying about 50 square feet of area. A gray-haired, grim-visaged lieutenant colonel named Maston M. Jacks held forth there, sitting behind a cluttered desk and jangling phones. His job in those days was to handle reporters inquiring about the UFO situation. His opening line was a showstopper. "There's nothing to it, Mr. Keele. It's all a lot of hearsay." On another desk, there was a large red folder with the words "Top Secret" emblazoned in big black letters. While we talked, a secretary entered and put a newspaper clipping into the folder. My first conversation with Lieutenant Colonel Jacks quickly turned into an argument. He parroted the well-known Air Force anti-UFO line, and I explained gently that I had seen some of the damn things myself. At one point, he pulled himself up and glared at me. "Are you calling an officer in the U.S. Air Force a liar?" Later on the phone, and from his inflection, it was obvious he was talking to a superior officer. I discreetly strolled to the far end of the room and stared out of the tiny prison-like window. He mumbled something about some movie film, and then in a very low voice he added, "I'll have to call you back. There's somebody here in my office that I've got to stop." After he hung up, we resumed our argument. He had clearly gone through this many times before. It was all an act. His moods changed abruptly from rage to politeness to chumminess. Finally, he escorted me down the hall to a library and dumped me. Jax told me several times that the Air Force did not have any kind of UFO photo file. A year later, however, a science writer named Lloyd Malyon was given over 100 pictures from the non-existent file. Jax also informed me that no UFO reports were stored in the Pentagon. They were all at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. I didn't visit Wright-Patterson, but Mort Young of the now-defunct New York Journal-American did. I asked Mort to write his experience for this book. Records of UFO reports, I was told at the Pentagon, are all kept at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio, Mort explains. So I went to Dayton. There I was told that UFO reports are filed at the Pentagon and I could have seen them in Washington. I later learned that not only are UFO reports filed at the Pentagon and at Project Blue Book headquarters in Dayton, but are also forwarded to at least 2 other addresses where presumably they are also filed. One might hope that at these other places the files are in better order than at Blue Book, where individual sightings are incomplete. Files I asked for were either handed to me with pages missing, entire parts missing, or the file itself was missing, the Air Force having no information on the sighting in question. Some files were in disreputable state, page upon page, jammed into brown folders. The information that was there would have to be sorted chronologically, at least before one could sit down, read it through, and come out the wiser. I would rather try to explain a UFO than make sense out of an Air Force UFO report. Some of the allegations of the UFO believers had merit. The Air Force was struggling to keep the issues confused. They did lie, and on occasion they lied outrageously to reporters. Photographs sent to them by well-meaning citizens often disappeared forever at Wright-Patterson. But from my own investigations, I could not honestly accuse them of having a wing of Oriental officers whose assignment was to squelch witnesses. Other writers, such as Lloyd Malyon, were reaching similar conclusions. By 1967, Lieutenant Colonel Jax had retired and been replaced by Lieutenant Colonel George P. Freeman. Freeman was a kinder, more tactful soul and gave our reports serious consideration. On February 15, 1967, a confidential letter went out from the Pentagon to all commands. Information has reached headquarters, USAF, that persons claiming to represent the Air Force or other defense establishments have contacted citizens who have sighted unidentified flying objects. In one reported case, an individual in civilian clothes who represented himself as a member of NORAD demanded and received photos belonging to a private citizen. In another, a person in an Air Force uniform approached local police and other citizens who had sighted a UFO, assembled them in a schoolroom, and told them they did not see what they thought they saw and that they should not talk to anyone about the sighting. All military and civilian personnel, and particularly information officers and UFO investigating officers who hear such reports, should immediately notify their local OSI, Office of Special Investigations, offices. Signed, Hewitt T. Wheelis, Lieutenant General, USAF, Assistant Vice Chief of Staff. Very interesting. So, we have the government itself admitting that there are these men in black people impersonating as U.S. government officers, unless this whole document is a disinfo document, but this document appears to be genuine, that it is coming from the U.S. government. Project Blue Book was formally shut down in December 1969, but the Men in Black have not retired. They were busy again in the wake of the October 1973 UFO wave, and in January 1974, they appeared in Sweden, using the same tactics that were so effective here. Even the gasoline shortage failed to deter those black Cadillacs from their mysterious rounds. So John Keel is clearly quite familiar with the UFO world, the government handling of UFOs, and even being threatened to stop looking into UFOs by both the U.S. government and these certain men in black, foreign-looking men supposedly impersonating the U.S. government. Some people theorize that these men in black agents are actually aliens or some other kind of entities. I went into that in the previous episode, so I'm not going to go too far into the men in black in this episode. We're going to focus mostly on the UFOs themselves. So, the Point Pleasant encounters of UFOs. Many Mothman witnesses actually also cited UFOs. It's very strange. Some of them had poltergeist activity in their house. We'll get into that in the next episode. But there's this intertwined web of paranormal insanity. Some people think Point Pleasant just happened to be a nexus of interdimensional shifting of some kind, and all these things, the Mothman, the UFOs, all this unexplained paranormal and supernatural activity is connected in some way to the physical location of Point Pleasant and the surrounding area. So let's go over the encounters from John Keel's book. In March 1966, a shapely housewife, whom I will call Mrs. Kelly because she asked that her name be withheld, was waiting in her car for her children near the Point Pleasant school when she saw an unbelievable apparition low in the sky. It looked like a glistening metal disc and was hovering directly above the school playground. A door-like aperture was opened at its rim, and there was a man standing outside. He was not standing in the doorway, he was standing outside the object in midair. He wore a silvery skin-tight costume and had very long silvery hair. He was looking down into the schoolyard intently. She watched him for a long moment until her children bounded up to the car. When she looked again, the man and the object were gone. She decided not to tell anyone about this strange vision, attaching religious significance to it. That summer, Mrs. Mary Hyre was driving along the Ohio side of the river when a sudden glint in the sky attracted her attention. At first, I thought it was a plane, she recalled. Then I got a better look at it. It was perfectly round. I couldn't make out what it was, but I didn't give it any thought at the time. Another round object chose to hover around Tiny's restaurant just outside Point Pleasant that summer, where it had been seen by a number of customers, including the wife of a local police officer. Tiny stands on the corner of the street where the McDaniels live. The McDaniel family would later serve as the focus for many of the strange manifestations. Not one person bothered to report a UFO sighting to the law or press in Point Pleasant, although there were many such sightings all summer long. Very, very interesting. And of course, John Keel and others theorized that there were hundreds and hundreds of sightings because most people simply did not report them. And we'll actually get into the frequency of UFO sightings at certain locations around Point Pleasant and how absolutely bizarre they are as we go down the list. So from John Keel's book, once again, while driving toward New Cumberland, we saw a light hovering near a hillside. John Vujnovic, an attorney from Weirton, West Virginia, said, describing his experience on the evening of October 7th, 1966. The light started coming toward the car, and I guess my son was frightened, and I slowed the car so that we were a good distance behind the object. Once again, just quick reference point, these UFOs were sighted even before the Mothman. So this was before the major Mothman sightings. The object had an outer circular light that glowed, but there was no sound at all. I stopped the car for a better look, and the thing started coming down over the highway. I think it was about 400 feet in the air. Mr. Vujnovic was driving south on State Route 66 from Chester, West Virginia to Weirton in the northernmost tip of the state. He was one of the first important sightings in West Virginia that October, a month that would produce sensational incidents all up and down the eastern seaboard. At one time, it looked as if there were windows in the craft, and after it got past, we could see a revolving light. The outer glow of the light made a fast, flickering type of light as the object was hovering. It eventually disappeared as Mr. Vujnovic went on his way. In the weeks that followed, the lights and some dark objects of awesome size were seen from one end of the state to the other. In Sistersville, a town mentioned in the 1897 airship reports, local UFO fans organized an informal warning system, calling each other on party lines to announce curtly, UFO, Northeast, etc. The town's newspaper did not bother to publish a single report. Every night at approximately 8 p.m., one of these brilliant flashing lights would cruise majestically over the Ohio River, traversing Point Pleasant from north to south. Those who bothered to notice it at all assumed it was an airplane. Mrs. Kelly, the lady who had seen the long-haired man standing in the sky 7 months earlier, lived in a house on the edge of a deep gully. She and her children were seeing blinding globes of light traveling close to the ground along that gully nightly. And her telephone was behaving strangely, ringing when there was no one on the line, and sometimes emitting beeps like Morse code. Once again, this phenomenon is reported throughout the entire Mothman accounts over this 13-month period and beyond, closer to a 2-year period actually, not to mention all these other UFO accounts that had similar electromagnetic disturbances, phones, TV, all that stuff, similar stuff that's associated with ghosts or poltergeist activity. And John Keel actually makes note of all of this. Like, this guy is a smart man, and we'll actually get into some of the tactics he uses to kind of fake people out and verify some of his findings. Very, very interesting guy. Early in November, an elderly man walked into Mary Hyre's newspaper's office. "I've just got to tell somebody," he began nervously. The story he unfolded seemed totally unbelievable to Mrs. Hyre, who knew nothing of UFOs at the time, but she knew the man and was impressed by his sincerity. On November 2nd, 1966, he said he and another workman were driving home to Point Pleasant from their job near Marietta, Ohio, on Interstate 77. As they neared Parkersburg, West Virginia, an elongated object appeared low in the sky and descended directly in front of them. They stopped their car and a man emerged from the object and walked over to them. He looked like a normal man and was grinning broadly. He wore a black coat and kept his arms folded with his hands out of sight under his armpits. The witness rolled his window down and there was a very brief conversation. The stranger asked the pair who they were, where they were from, where they were going, and what time was it. Then he strolled back to the dark cylinder and it rose quickly into the chill, drizzling sky. Bizarre. I mean, this is stuff that's probably even more bizarre than all the Mothman sightings. The two men had a strong emotional reaction to the seemingly pointless encounter. They debated whether they should tell anybody, deciding against it, but the Point Pleasant resident found himself suffering from insomnia, and when he finally slept, he had strange nightmares. He started to hit the bottle, something very unusual for him. Mrs. Hyre listened to his story, nonplussed, and made a few notes. A day or so later, the man's son called on her and asked her not to print the story. Several weeks later, she repeated the story to me, and we called the man on our office phone. He verified the details and then said, "Look, don't use my name. I don't want to get involved in this thing. That scientist fella told me." "What scientist?" I asked. "A couple of weeks after this thing happened, a scientist from Ohio came to see us. He told us it would be better if we forget the whole thing." "How did you hear about it? How did he find you?" "Damned if I know." "Did he identify himself?" "Sure, but I can't remember his name, but he seemed to know what he was talking about." I couldn't get much else out of him. I would have ignored the whole story except for one jarring fact. The same thing had happened the same night on the same road to another West Virginian. Unlike the 2 Point Pleasant residents, he had gone to the police with his story. A press conference was held and he was catapulted into the never never land of the UFO contactees. The center of one of the biggest UFO stories of 1966. This man was Woodrow Derenberger, and his story is that of Indrid Cold, covered in the previous episode. So that very night, there was another account. I mean, this is just, there's so much corroboration of all these strange happenings in Point Pleasant, West Virginia. To completely write all of them off as some kind of a mass hysteria, it's absolutely asinine. That's the only way to put it. Like, there's all these people reporting something and countless others not reporting. And I mean, it's very reasonable to assume there was at least some other sightings, and it's likely a whole lot of other sightings and encounters, and people just don't want to deal with it. And some of them, there's a lot of cases of amnesia with these cases, with the encounters with UFOs, the sightings, the Mothman, all of this stuff. So people that might have actually even wanted to come forward, if they have missing time and amnesia and everything, they wouldn't be able to come forward even if they wanted to. Like, we might be only getting the stories that were the glitches, the amnesia that didn't work for whatever reason, from whatever force is behind all of these strange happenings. Back to the book. Across the Ohio River, almost directly opposite the TNT area, a music teacher, Mrs. Roy Gross, was wakened by the barking of her dog at 4:45 a.m. on the morning of November 17th, 1966. It was unusual for her little pet to bark late at night, so she got up to investigate. The moon was out and was very bright, she recalled. She looked out the kitchen window and saw an enormous object hovering at treetop level in a field on the other side of Route 7. It was circular, the size of a small house, and brilliantly illuminated. It seemed to be divided into sections glowing with dazzling bright red and green lights. I was stunned, she said. Before she could wake up her husband, the object made a zigzag motion and suddenly disappeared. She did not mention the sighting to anyone outside her immediate family until weeks later. This also happened to be near the Cheshire Mothman sighting, which occurred that afternoon, November 17th, 1966. So this is only one day after the original Scarberry Mallet account of the Mothman encounter in the TNT area, which kind of kick-started this whole frenzy of Mothman lore. It's just, there's so much more going on besides the Mothman. I mean, I don't want to say it's more interesting or more bizarre, but there's a case to be made that it is. Okay, we mentioned Tad Jones in the previous episode for his Men in Black encounter, and I'm going to go into the Chad Jones story for a more complete look on what he saw regarding the UFO and how it factored into these other events. Enter Tad Jones, a rarity among UFO witnesses because of his very common name. A gentle, handsome man in his 30s, Mr. Jones was a deeply religious person who did not smoke or drink. In 1967, he lived in Dunbar, a suburb of Charleston, West Virginia, and managed an appliance store at a place called Cross Lanes. Urbane, intelligent, and articulate, he was one of the most impressive UFO witnesses I have met in my travels. At 9:05 a.m. on the morning of January 19th, 1967, Tad was driving to his store along the newly completed multi-lane highway, Route 64, about 10 miles outside of Charleston. A large object was blocking the road ahead of him, and he first assumed it was a vehicle being used by a construction gang still working on the highway. But as he drew closer, he saw that it was hovering in the air about 4 feet off the ground. It was a large metal sphere, he said. Since it was broad daylight, I got a very good look at it. It was about 20 feet in diameter and was the color of dull aluminum. He slowed his car and studied the thing for about 2 minutes. There were 4 legs attached to it, he continued, with caster-like wheels on the bottom of each one, and there was a small window about 9 inches in diameter on the side facing me, but I couldn't see anything inside the sphere. On the underside, there was something like a propeller. It was idling when I first drove up, then it started spinning faster and the whole object began to rise upward. It disappeared into the sky and I drove on to my store. Shaken and puzzled by his sighting, he decided to call the police and report it. His story quickly found its way into the local papers. The next morning, a crude note was slipped under his door in Dunbar. Written on ordinary notebook paper in block letters, it stated, "We know what you have seen and we know that you have talked. You'd better keep your mouth shut." He decided it had to be the work of some local prankster. In nearby St. Albans, Mr. Ralph Jarrett, a chemical engineer and the local UFO authority, was shaving that morning when his telephone rang. He put down his razor and went into the bedroom to pick up the extension. "I heard a very clear beep beep sound," Jarrett said. "The beeping continued for about 2, maybe 3 minutes. Then the phone went dead and the dial tone came on. I've heard all sorts of code transmissions on shortwave, but nothing quite like that." He went downstairs to breakfast and opened his copy of the Charleston Gazette and read about Tad Jones's sighting, the first he had heard of it. Jarrett, an aggressive, loquacious, middle-aged man, was a highly qualified investigator. He later contacted Jones and conducted a thorough study of the case. He discovered the object had been hovering directly above a major gas line which passed under the road. There have been other sightings of UFOs directly over buried gas lines. Very interesting. A few days later, another note was slipped under the door of the Joneses' home in Dunbar. This one was written on a piece of cardboard which had been burned around the edges. It repeated the earlier threat, adding, "There won't be another warning." I guess that's supposed to be won't, so they spelled won't wrong, and it says want. I arrived on the scene several weeks later, and during my questioning, he remembered another incident which seemed unimportant to him at the time. About a week after his sighting, he was driving along the same highway at the same time in the morning when he came upon a man standing by the road in approximately the same spot where the sphere had hovered. Thinking the man was hitchhiking and was stranded in the isolated stretch of road, Jones slowed his truck and called out to him, "Want a lift?" The man did not reply but merely waved him on. The next morning, the same man was in the same place, but this time, Tad did not slow down. He was very tanned, Jones recalled, or his face was very flushed. He looked normal and was wearing a blue coat and a blue cap with a visor. Something like a uniform, I guess. I noticed he was holding a box in his hand, some kind of instrument. It had a large dial on it, like a clock, and a wire ran from it to his other hand. Later, we checked the local gas companies to find out if they had a man walking the line in that area. The answer was negative. I also asked about instruments such as Tad had described. No such instruments were in use. When Mrs. Hyre and I visited the spot on Route 64, we found a series of strange footprints in the mud beside the road. One group of footprints was identical to those I had found behind the power plant in the TNT area the previous December. They looked like huge dog tracks and were so deep the animal who made them must have weighed 200 pounds or more. I couldn't relate them to the Mothman, and there were a lot of dogs in the area, so I didn't think much about them at the time. Tad made plaster casts of these new prints, however, and none of the local wildlife authorities could identify them. I guess it's not a sandhill crane or an owl. They were not dog tracks. Zoologist Ivan Sanderson later rejected the big dog explanation also and told me similar tracks frequently turned up in places where paranormal events had occurred. And in fact, I have since come across them myself in several spots around the country. Aside from dog tracks, we found a single footprint of what appeared to be a large naked human foot. This was planted in the center of a muddy section with no other footprints of any kind around it. But a short distance away, I came across some old friends, a type of footprint that has appeared at many UFO sites around the country. They look like the prints made by Ripple-soled shoes, but their spacing is always peculiar. They don't start anywhere and they don't lead anywhere. Ripple soles had been a fashion in the early 1960s and then had faded out. I had once owned a pair myself, but the phantom prints had a ridge around the edges. Years later, when the first men walked on the moon, I realized the photos of the prints left by their moonwalking shoes were identical to the footprints I had seen over and over again in my travels. Obviously, the Martians and the Venetians buy their equipment from the same companies that supply our space program. Haha, very funny, Mr. Keele. So here's what's even more bizarre. This next piece of information will rattle the brains of everyone listening. I mean, it is beyond mind-shocking, even more mind-shocking than all of these UFO sightings that I just mentioned. A few days after Tad Jones's sighting on Route 64, True magazine hit the stands with an article of mine, John Keel's, about flying saucers. It was illustrated with drawings of all kinds of odd-shaped objects, many of them the pure product of the artist's imagination. It included an exact replica of Jones's sphere, complete with the wheeled legs and propeller. An object exactly like this had never been described in UFO literature before or since. The artist had produced his layout many weeks before. Somehow the phenomena had mischievously duplicated the artist's conception for Jones's benefit. Interesting. Are we tapping into the cosmic consciousness or some kind of unified idea or energy that can affect anyone in the world at any time? Or are we talking some kind of weird time travel effects? This is just bizarre. If we are to believe John Keel here, which most of this information is verified third party. I mean, these reports were filed. I actually read through the original reports from the Scarberry Mallet sightings, the original police reports, and you can see them. They're handwritten statements. Most of this stuff is all completely verified by everyone, including Mary Hyre, and I will get to sworn affidavits written by both John Keel and Mary Hyre. Now, those might carry slightly less weight today, but back in the 60s and the early 70s, I mean, people didn't just write those for no reason. And keep in mind, once again, John Keel is not... I'm going to give away a little bit here. John Keel I don't know if he made a definitive position, but he's exploring other options than these UFOs being from other planets. Let's just put it that way for now. So on to the next accounts from John Keel's book. A young couple, very much in love, sprawled together in the back seat of an old jalopy on a deserted dirt road in the isolated back hills east of Ravenswood, West Virginia. It was a starlit, moonless night in the spring of 1967, just warm enough so that the pair were able to strip to the buff comfortably. Things were rather pleasant on that squeaky back seat until about 10:30 p.m. when a blinding bluish light poured in through the windows of the parked car. At first I thought it was the police, the young man told me later. Then we both felt a funny tingling sensation that scared us half out of our wits. I jumped up and stared into the light. It wasn't a flashlight or spotlight. It was more like a big ball of bluish fire, hovering a couple of feet off the ground directly alongside the car. There was a funny sound too, like a low hum. His girlfriend screamed, he reported, and the light seemed to back away slightly while the humming increased in volume. The next thing we knew, the young man continued, it was gone, just like that. We jumped into our clothes and got the hell out of there. Another funny thing, when we got into town, it was after 12:30. We couldn't figure it out. It seemed like we only looked at the light for a couple of seconds, but somehow it must have taken 2 hours. Once again, we're seeing this time slip, missing time phenomena associated with UFOs, alien abductions, all of these things. It's just coming up time and time and time again. Very, very strange. Their first inclination was to run to the police, but they decided against it since they weren't supposed to be on that road doing what they were doing in the first place. Her old man would have killed me. They drove around for several minutes until their hysteria subsided, and then he dropped her off at home. The next morning, both the boy and the girl woke up to find themselves heavily sunburned from head to foot. The boy's eyes were almost swollen shut for 2 weeks afterwards. It was not an easy matter for them to explain how they managed to get a total and quite painful sunburn at night in the early spring. Shortly afterward, he heard that I was in the area, and he sought me out to tell me the story. His skin was still reddish, and his eyes were still bothering him when I met him. The actinic ray burns were proof of his story, and I knew that UFOs often zero in on lovers in parked cars. Most of the monster episodes in my files took place in remote lovers' lanes. Young love has to run enough hazards without the fear of a hairy weirdo hammering on the windshield. What concerned me was the 2-hour time lapse, or a spell of lacunal amnesia, which apparently took place. What could have happened to the pair during that forgotten period? That's pretty creepy. Thinking about the missing time and what could have happened. I mean, what could have happened? I mean, it's really, really rough. Yeah, it's tough. Really creepy. Anything could have happened. I mean, you look at all these UFO cases. Some of them are just really, really bizarre. So let's look at these encounters so far relative to all the Mothman activity going on. My questions are this. Why are these UFO encounters so often ignored, especially in conjunction with the Mothman sightings? Are skeptics who think the Mothman was just a bird or owl willing to ignore all these other encounters and sightings, many presented with real physical evidence like burns? Not logical. Clearly there was something incredible going on in West Virginia. These overlapping phenomena are just too coincidental to ignore. What are the chances there was no link at all? If it was just 1 or 2 stray UFO sightings and encounters, it could be written off. But the sheer magnitude of cases is mind-boggling, mind-shocking. It's just completely insane. And again, we have to factor in there were many cases that weren't reported, and still all of these cases that were. Alright, let's go into animal mutilations and the like, because there were these as well. I mean, there's just no shortage of bizarre phenomena going on in Point Pleasant, West Virginia during this time period. John Keel writes, Elsewhere throughout the Ohio River Valley, dogs, cows, and horses were dying suddenly and mysteriously, usually from surgical-like incisions in their throats. Animal disappearances and deaths go hand in hand with the UFO phenomena. The most puzzling aspect of these deaths is the absence of blood. Often the carcasses seemed drained of all blood. The wounds don't bleed. No blood is in evidence in the grass or dirt where the victims lay. Among my grimmer memories of 1966 to 1967 are those times when I knelt in farm fields to examine dead animals, particularly dogs, who had suffered amazingly clean and expert cuts. These deaths were not localized, but came in nationwide waves simultaneously with UFO waves. This pattern has been repeated since. Prior to the October 1973 flying saucer flap, there was an epidemic of animal deaths throughout the Midwest from Minnesota to Mississippi, causing quite a stir in the local press. Again, something that is not talked about. Was a sandhill crane or owl killing all these animals as well? And how come all these animal deaths weren't occurring before or after this time period of the Mothman sightings? Just bizarre things to think about. How come the UFO activity wasn't rampant before and after? I mean, it kicked off a couple months before and lasted a couple months after or so. But how come 10 years prior this wasn't a hotspot? How come 10 years after it wasn't a hotspot? How come it was only this time period? Questions that need to be asked. So John Keele drops a very interesting theory next. He writes, "It does seem as if many UFO and monster sightings are staged as distractions, luring crowds of people to places like the TNT area while animal mutilations and disappearances are taking place almost unnoticed, only a few miles away." Soon after the Mothman's first appearance in November 1966, police found the body of a dog in the TNT area. It was completely charred, yet the surrounding area was unburned. I wondered if it might not have been sacrificed in some secret magical ritual by some unknown local warlock, a ritual that brought Mothman into being. So, wow. Very, very interesting theory dropped here. Since we're focusing on UFOs for this episode, the occult connections will be gone over in the next episodes, not this one, but you just have to think about this for a second. If the UFO and Mothman sightings are distractions, I mean, Keele is going to a very, very insane place here. If extraterrestrial beings or other entities, interdimensional beings, or possibly a government experiment of some kind, are they running multiple experiments at once while getting these blood samples from animals, killing animals, abducting animals while diverting people's attention away? Is this some kind of like super efficient experiment of some kind? I mean, it's really, really bizarre. Is it using advanced technology? Are these humans doing this? Are they not? Are they interdimensional entities? Does this have links to other paranormal and supernatural activity? Just very, very bizarre questions. But one of the reasons that the Mothman case is so fascinating, and I believe is deserving of very, very deep research that has not really been done. Like, the Bigfoot community is very, very big. There's ongoing research. With the Mothman phenomenon, there doesn't seem to be as much research, but it seems to link to all of these other paranormal and supernatural occurrences. So if there's a common thread, I think the Mothman is a pretty good place to look to find evidence of that. So, back to John Keele. The UFO waves of the 1960s were accompanied by the occult explosion, the rapid spread of witchcraft and magical practices. An interesting side effect of the flying saucer phenomenon is that many of the people attracted to the subject, people with very materialistic and pseudoscientific outlooks, gradually drift into the study of psychic phenomena, abandoning the extraterrestrial theory along the way. In retrospect, flying saucers were partly responsible for the occult explosion. The most confusing feature of the phenomena is its use of allegorical situations and complicated diversions meant to cover up some more covert activity. Hairy monsters are seen carrying dead dogs, so people assume other missing dogs provided dinner for the smelly apparition. Actually, the dogs may have served some other purpose altogether, a purpose that might turn our hair gray instantly if we knew the full details. How cryptic, Mr. John Keel. I mean, come on. In messages passed along to Italian contactee Eugenio Siragusa, the mischievous entities have tried to explain their volumetric logic in cosmic double talk. Dr. Jacques Vallée had called it metalogic, suggesting that the entities have a logic system quite different from ours, and when they try to translate things on our level, their statements come out absurd. He does not consider their need for deceit, which is based upon their urge to manipulate us through beliefs and what the British call acceptances. Once Woodrow Derenberger accepted Indrid Cold's existence and the existence of Lenulos, his view of reality could be manipulated to include those beings and places. I don't want to go too deep into where John Keel is going here, but he's going in a complete sideways direction from aliens, UFOs, and all of this other business. And we will be looking into that in the later episodes as well. But that was just a minor preview. Things are not as they seem. That much we can be sure of. We're going to move on to one of the most bizarre UFO incidents ever recorded. March 5th, 1967, a UFO actually chased a bloodmobile. That's right, a Red Cross medical van carrying blood was pursued and attacked by a UFO. So, here we go. John Keel writes, in March 1967, a truly astonishing UFO attack took place in West Virginia, apparently supporting the vampiric theories I was entertaining at the time. While other UFO investigators had been collecting endless descriptions of things seen in the sky, I was out examining dead animals in remote fields, pondering the real meaning behind the bloodless carcasses. On the night of March 5th, a Red Cross bloodmobile was traveling along Route 2, which runs parallel to the Ohio River. Bo Schertzer, 21, and a young nurse had been out all day collecting human blood, and now they were heading back to Huntington, West Virginia, with a van filled with fresh blood. The road was dark and cold, and there was very little traffic. As they moved along a particularly deserted stretch, there was a flash in the woods on a nearby hill, and a large white glow appeared. It rose slowly into the air and flew straight for their vehicle. "My God, what is it?" the nurse cried. "I'm not going to stick around to find out," Schertzer answered, pushing his foot down on the gas. The object effortlessly swooped over the van and stayed with it. Schertzer rolled down his window and looked up. He was horrified to see some kind of arm or extension being lowered from the luminous thing, cruising only a few feet above the bloodmobile. "It's trying to get us," the nurse yelled, watching another arm reach down on her side. It looked as if the flying object was trying to wrap a pincers-like device around the vehicle. Schertzer poured on the horses, but the object kept pace with them easily. Apparently, they were saved by the sudden appearance of headlights from approaching traffic. As the other cars neared, the object retracted the arms and hastily flew off. Both young people rushed to the police in a state of hysteria. The incident was mentioned briefly on the radio newscast that night, but was not picked up by the newspapers. In cases like this, we have to ask, did the UFO really intend to carry off the bloodmobile? Or was it all a sham to prove the UFO interest in blood? Later, I tried to check to find out if any bloodmobiles had actually vanished anywhere. The Red Cross thought I was a bit nuts. But I often found myself seriously wondering if we only hear about the people who get away. So, very interesting concepts here from John Keel referencing blood. John Keel also talked with the driver's father, who was a school teacher in Point Pleasant. The father seemed convinced that his son was telling the truth, and he was so scared that he now refuses to drive along that highway, even in the daylight. Okay. So, let me reference the demonic alien theory. So those that subscribe to the aliens or demons theory, they also reference the blood scavenging. If the blood of true living organisms is sacred, or organisms with souls, or has some kind of energy that the demons crave, need, or use as a fuel source of some kind, wouldn't they constantly be after it? So this is a pretty out there theory, but it's not new. It's been around for a bit. And it does explain the cattle mutilations, animal mutilations, some of the experiments done on the humans in abductions and the like. There's also quite a few cases where the person being abducted, the abductee, prays to Jesus or to God or some kind of reference to Christian faith or God or divinity, and the abduction just completely stops. Like the entities are afraid somehow of the name of Jesus or God or any of this stuff. So, I mean, it's not just one or two cases that this has happened in. There's quite a few reports of this kind of being a way to stop the abduction. And some people use this as evidence that these aliens are simply demons masquerading as aliens. And there's references to this going back in history quite a bit. So it's an interesting theory, and the linking of blood to this theory is also interesting. Human blood is often viewed as sacred in a lot of ancient civilizations and ancient mythologies. So that demonic or evil entities would be after it as a way to kind of preserve their own life or feed off of it. And in physics, with plasma physics and all of these things, as of yet undiscovered in the modern field of science relating to human blood, that could possibly point to this theory being true. So John Keel does touch upon it here, and in the later episodes we'll be getting more into the occult connection and other things which would involve this. But it's very, very interesting, and I don't think it should be dismissed without proper investigation. Like all things, it needs to be looked at. Okay, but blood aside, let's look at how insane this UFO encounter really is. How often does a UFO use some kind of pincer or claw-like device to try to lift a vehicle from the road? Like, what's it gonna do with it? And this isn't like a tiny little smart car. Like, it's a good-sized vehicle. It's like a van. And like, what is it gonna do with it? I mean, it's so bizarre and mind-boggling. Like many things in this Mothman case. I mean, and most people don't know about it. Like this, Mothman aside, just in UFO lore, like this should be a case of just huge magnitude. It's just so shocking. Reported to police, with people who are supposedly good witnesses. Like, they're not looking for attention. I mean, I've gone over this many times. I believe that most people are telling the truth or what they believe to be the truth. So, again, not that this is an extraterrestrial craft, but something attacked them that looked like this and had claws like this. It appeared to be this, and they believed that it was this. I think that much is a logical step that we can make. So, this is mind-boggling. Like, it's truly, truly mind-boggling, and how much of this is connected to everything else. I think there are connections everywhere, and discovering these connections can help us see what really happened in Point Pleasant, West Virginia during those 2 years. So, onward to the other sightings. A few nights after the remarkable Bloodmobile incident, Point Pleasant police officer Harold Herman was making a routine patrol through the dismal, unlit TNT area when a dark object hovering a few feet above a small pond caught his eye. It was definitely a solid machine of some kind, he told me later. I could even see what appeared to be windows in it. It rocked unevenly, like a boat hitting waves, and then it floated silently away over the trees. Another nationwide UFO wave was underway that March, but the now jaded national news media ignored it. That's another interesting point to ponder. Like, if these UFOs are reported that frequently, that they just kind of stop covering it because it's such an often seen phenomena. I mean, that's insane. Like, if we had a UFO wave now anywhere, like Los Angeles, New York City, like Miami, big cities, and it just kept happening night after night after night after night, at what point would it be like, oh, okay, whatever, we'll stop covering it? I don't know. That's weird. It's really weird to think about at what point this would move into normalcy. The other thing I often wonder regards to UFOs, how often are these UFOs flying around when nobody's witnessing them? If they're not extraterrestrials or UFOs, I mean, it's the old, tree falling in the woods comparison. But is there something to that? Are these UFOs a show for specific people to see them? John Keel definitely thinks there's something to this. So, once again, I mean, John Keel was he became friends with a lot of these people in Point Pleasant. Like, they were going through something completely insane and bizarre between the Mothman UFO, Men in Black activity, and the poltergeist activity. Like, he was there documenting it relatively non-judgmentally, because he was a UFOologist. He had seen phenomena of all kinds. Like, the police are talking to him, they're giving him their accounts. Like, they basically trust him. That's why this account is it's really, really interesting. This isn't some weird one-off incident like in so many other cases. So back to his book, Drazen and Australia returned to New York City in late March while I decided to remain on in Point Pleasant. Dan was convinced that something exceptional was happening in the Ohio Valley, and he planned to collect a camera crew and return. We had seen a number of odd aerial lights, but the oddest of all was so bewildering I didn't even bother to take notes. We were standing on a hilltop outside of Point Pleasant one night when Mrs. Hyre called our attention to a bright red light slowly moving toward us. It had the shimmering, prismatic appearance of the classic UFO light, and Dan, who was a student pilot, agreed it wasn't a plane. No normal wing lights or tail lights were visible. The sky was crystal clear, and there was only one small cloud overhead. The light moved very slowly and appeared to be at a low altitude. There was no sound whatsoever. We watched as the light slowly approached the little cloud and disappeared into it or over it. Then we waited for it to reappear. Seconds ticked into minutes. The light did not come out from behind the cloud. Maybe it went straight up, Mary suggested. Suddenly, there was the distinctive drone of an airplane engine, and the obvious silhouette of a small plane emerged from the cloud, wing and tail lights flashing. It buzzed off at an altitude of 3,000 or 4,000 feet, and we laughed at ourselves, momentarily convinced that our UFO had just been an airplane. However, the more I thought about the incident, the more incredible it seemed. We should have been able to see the plane's silhouette clearly before it entered the cloud, and it should not have taken so long to pass through such a small cloud. Something was definitely out of kilter. Later, I began to study the mystery airplanes and phantom helicopters that have appeared all over the world, and several reports of UFOs that seemingly turned into conventional airplane configurations surfaced. One of the most recent comes from Canada, where a group of outdoorsmen on the Cowichan River in British Columbia watched a low-flying object in October. It didn't make a sound, and it was something we had never seen before, one of the witnesses reported. There were 3 red lights rotating around the top part, and there were blinking red lights going in the opposite direction around the middle part. There was another light at the very top, a red flashing one. Then, from the bottom, a white light shone out like a spotlight. It moved its beam up the river as if it was looking for something. By this time, we were all pretty scared. We thought sure the others at the camp must have seen it too, but afterward they said they hadn't seen a thing. Very interesting. It's also interesting that Keel keeps finding parallels with sightings and encounters all over the world. This isn't just happening in West Virginia. So there was a bend in the river between us, so I couldn't say for sure whether they did or not. The witnesses claimed they got a good look at the thing, that it was circular, about 80 feet in diameter, hovering about 200 feet in the air, and had been in view for a full 15 minutes. How did it depart? Well, if we told people about this, they'd think we were crazy, the witness said, but all of a sudden, it looked as if it had turned into an airplane. It made a noise like a plane, and it looked like a plane, only all the lights went out except for a little red one. It went right past us and disappeared over the trees. Throughout West Virginia, throughout West Virginia, I had heard stories of large, gray, unmarked airplanes hedge-hopping the treacherous hills. I knew the Air National Guard kept some cargo planes at the Charleston airport and that some training flights involved hedge-hopping to keep below radar beams. But none of the flights reported to me proved to be the work of the National Guard. Drazen in Australia had hardly started out for New York when all hell began to break loose. Late on the afternoon of March 31st, a workman in Point Pleasant lumber yard saw a glowing object hovering over the home of Mrs. Doris DeWeese. Shortly afterwards, Mrs. DeWeese watched a luminous object zip across the sky and crash into a small shack on a neighboring hillside. The shack housed the transmitter for Sheriff Johnson's police radio. It started to burn. What followed was straight out of the Keystone Cops. The police and fire department rushed to the snow-covered hill and bogged down on the mushy dirt road. There was much frantic scurrying and cursing as the men battled the blaze. Part of the hillside was badly scorched. The transmitter inside the shack was not affected by the fire, but it was burned out as if it had been struck by lightning. So in the critical days that followed, the sheriff's department was without its main transmitter. So is this some crazy hardcore physical evidence of weirdness or what? People that just attribute this whole Mothman madness, oh, just a sandhill crane or an owl. Well, what is striking sheds, lights crashing into sheds and taking out transmitters, people with burns on their whole body and their eyes, I mean, countless witnesses corroborating other witnesses. This is clearly not mass hysteria. I mean, it's so far beyond that easy cognitive dissonant dismissal of this entire situation going on in Point Pleasant, West Virginia. John Keel writes, I was disenchanted with the TNT area because of the crowds that were now streaming back there nightly to watch for the newest sensation, flying saucers. I started searching for a private place where I could carry out my observations quietly. Don, Dan, Mary, and myself had interviewed a number of people in the little community of Gallipolis Ferry, a couple of miles south of Point Pleasant on Route 2, and I had been impressed by their testimony. House lights frequently dimmed there, and television sets often acted up late at night. Great blobs of light had been seen on top of the wooded hills in the sparsely settled animal preserve called the Chief Cornstalk Hunting Grounds, just south of the village. One resident was having trouble with poltergeist phenomenon, lights moving throughout his house, rappings on the doors and windows, the sounds of babies crying, and women screaming, telephones malfunctioning, the works. Ralph Lee, a farmer with a big spread in the area, confessed that he had seen so many UFOs over his land that he didn't pay attention to them anymore. Wow. Can you imagine having seen this phenomena so many times that it moves into the everyday mundane, where you just don't pay attention to it anymore? This is really insane, but it goes to show that the plethora of UFO sightings surrounding the Mothman events was not simply just a couple of lights in the sky that happened to coincide with a sandhill crane sighting or two. Officer Harold Harmon and I slipped away to Gallipolis Ferry on the night of March 31st, while nearly everyone else headed for the TNT area. We soon saw a number of bright star-like objects which flittered above the sky with rapid zigzag movements. Two local teenagers were sitting on a nearby hilltop next to a roaring bonfire, hoping to lure the UFOs down. I called up to them and asked them to put the fire out, knowing that the bright lights tended to repel rather than attract the objects. Harmon fiddled vainly with his police radio. He could get nothing but static. Later I learned that all the police forces for miles in both directions had constant trouble with their radios that week. Heavy magnetic interference totally disrupted communications among law enforcement while the UFOs carried out their mysterious missions. The destruction of Sheriff Johnson's transmitter was just one small part of the scenario. Telephones, too, went bonkers that week. It seemed as if half the phones in the valley were either out of order altogether or were dogged with crazy beeps and buzzes. Accompanied by the two teenagers, I left Harmon and hiked into the nearby hills in total blackness. As my eyes became acclimated to the night, I began to distinguish a number of vague purple shapes hovering over the woods on Rolf Lee's property. At first I thought they might be stars low in the sky, gleaming through the natural haze. But when I flashed my six-celled light at one of these purple blobs, it suddenly and jerkily moved to one side as if it were jumping out of my light beam. Fascinated, I repeated the experiment several times. Then I tried flashing the light at obvious stars to see if this wasn't just some trick of my eyesight. The stars didn't move, naturally. We sat on the hilltop studying the purple blobs for several minutes when suddenly the whole forest in the valley below lit up and glowed with a bright, eerie purple light. There were no houses or roads down there. It would have been a long hike in the dark, and the boys were reluctant to join me, so we just sat and stared at the glowing forest until the light faded. That's a very interesting account by John Keele. He went down to Point Pleasant, West Virginia to report on phenomena, and he ends up seeing this absolute bizarre phenomena. Now, the purple glow and the purple light, instead of the usual green or red or whatever, we're going to get into why it's purple in a little bit, as there are many more strange connections to be made here. The next night, Saturday, April 1st, Mary Hyre and I drove up to 5 Mile Creek Road below Gallipolis Ferry until we reached a hilltop which commanded a view of the hills and valleys I had visited the night before. There was a single farmhouse on the hill, and the people who lived there went to bed at 9:30 each night, being early risers, so the whole area was silent, deserted, and without lights throughout the night. A few minutes after we arrived, Mary pointed out a small reddish light low on a steep wooded hill south of our position. It appeared to be blinking on and off and bobbing up and down in a manner quite different from any of the stars on the horizon. While we watched breathlessly, barely speaking, it slowly circled the distant fields and woods and crossed in front of us, edging closer and closer. Now we could make out a dark form. The red glow seemed to be a window. It hovered about 50 feet off the ground. I thought I could see a shadowy human figure in the window, but Mary thought it was some kind of partition. This was the only point on which we disagreed. We sat transfixed for several minutes, fully expecting the object to land directly in front of us and asked to be taken to our leader. I finally got out of the car and flashed my powerful beam directly at the object. It responded instantly, quickly shooting straight up into the sky, the red light going out completely. I guess I blew it, I groaned, but there would be other nights and more funny lights. The following night, we returned to the same hilltop. The brilliant night sky was filled with stars, and things not on my star map. We could easily recognize the UFOs because they were brighter and more brilliantly colored than the normal stars. Some were red flashers, some were cold purple blobs, and some were multicolored. Mrs. Hyre confirmed that they jumped out of the way of my flashlight. I picked out an especially large object and flashed "Descend" in Morse code. Mary gasped as it began to lose altitude. "It looks like it's going down a flight of stairs," she noted. We were watching the famous falling leaf motion, which had been described by many UFO witnesses. About 12:30 a.m., Mrs. Hyre decided to call it a night. She drove off, leaving me alone in my car, sitting like an idiot, waiting for something to happen. And it did. 1 hour later, at 1:35 a.m. on April 3rd, 1967, I had my best sighting. A clearly defined circular object suddenly zipped down from the sky and passed parallel to my car. It was so colorful that it burned into my memory. The greenish upper surface was topped by a bright red light. There were reddish portholes or circular lights around the rim. The colors were so brilliant they were almost unearthly. It disappeared behind some trees to my left. I felt it was very close, perhaps only a few hundred feet from my car. Although it had been in full view for several seconds, I never even thought of picking up the movie camera on the seat beside me. I had 3 interesting physical reactions to the sighting. First of all, although I am used to prowling graveyards and TNT areas alone late at night, I was scared to death. My first thought was to start the car and get the hell out of there, but I managed to brace myself. I did lock the car doors. Second, while I was watching the object, I thought I heard a sizzling or hissing sound. Later, I realized I couldn't be sure if the sound had been real. Third, the next morning, my eyes were sore and reddened. They felt like they were full of sand. I had a mild case of conjunctivitis, and it persisted for several days. In my notebook, I scribbled at 2 a.m., drove to Turnaround Point, a driveway by a barn down the road, turned and returned to the original parking position, unable to see anything in ravine. No lights or signs of activity, still scared, not anxious to get out of car. Another note reads, no sign of moon, which was supposed to rise at 1:59 a.m. This referred to something that had happened the night before. After the objects with the reddish window had disappeared, Mary and I sat in the darkness for a long time when suddenly a great glowing object appeared behind some trees on a distant hill. It was red and large, and we both thought we could see a human figure moving about on the hill. We really thought something had landed there. After a few minutes, the object slowly rose upward, and to our mutual embarrassment, we saw that it was the moon. I had never seen a moonrise exactly like that one, so I decided to deliberately watch the moon the following evening. I checked the papers for the time the moon was supposed to come up, but it never did. That night, as I said, was cloudless and star-filled, but the moon never appeared. I stayed in the area until 3:30 a.m., and the moon was still conspicuously absent when I left. The night after that, the moon appeared right on schedule. Sheriff Johnson, Deputy Halstead, Mary Hyre, and I went back to 5 Mile Creek Road the next afternoon to look for my saucer. Deputy Halstead carried a Geiger counter. As Johnson followed my car up the hill, he was startled when his car radio suddenly sprang to life, emitting police calls from the adjoining county. The amazing thing was that his radio was turned off at the time. It had to be turned on with a key, and the key was not even in the lock. We searched for scorched marks, broken tree limbs, radioactivity, anything that could have provided evidence of my sighting. But as Halstead and I clambered around the ravine, I was chagrined to find that my estimates must have been way off. The object must have been further away from me than I thought, and therefore it had to be bigger than I thought. I estimated it was only 15 or 20 feet in diameter. In my favor was the fact that there were widespread UFO sightings on the nights of April 2nd and 3rd. South of Charleston, West Virginia, a large group of people, including several state police officers, watched a formation of 15 lights maneuver over a forest and descend. Every night I went to the hill at 5 Mile Creek Road, sometimes alone, sometimes accompanied by a few others, and every night I saw a variety of strange aerial objects. Only 2 airplanes passed over on regular schedule, one at 11 p.m., one at 2 a.m. Each night from 3 to 8, unidentified stars appeared. They were always in the same position at the beginning of each evening, and a casual observer would automatically conclude they were really just stars. However, on overcast nights, these unidentifieds would be the only stars in the sky, meaning they were below the clouds. While the rest of the night sky slowly rotated, these phony stars would remain in their fixed positions, sometimes for hours, before they would begin to move. But they would travel in any direction, up, down, clockwise, etc. They had a number of curious traits. When a plane would fly over, they would suddenly dim or go out altogether. As soon as the plane was gone, they would flare up again. It was always impossible to judge their size, altitude, or distance. Sometimes I thought they were relatively close, only to find they were actually miles away traversing the river. Boatmen on the river were obviously watching them also. Occasionally, a searchlight from a riverboat would suddenly shoot into the sky, aimed straight at an object I was watching, and the object would skitter out of the way. I doubted that these funny lights were spaceships from Andromeda, and I made a strenuous effort to find rational explanations. Dr. Donald Menzel, a Harvard astronomer, advocates an air inversion theory, contending that these lights are ordinary lights reflecting off layers of warm or cold air and producing a mirage effect. This theory wasn't workable on 5 Mile Creek Road simply because there weren't enough light sources. A large radio antenna some miles down the river did provide some interesting effects. When there was a haze, the flashing red lights on the antenna were an eerie sight from my hill and never failed to excite first-time visitors to my lookout post. 3 or 4 days after my monumental UFO sighting, I was sitting in Mary's office when she became very thoughtful. You know, there's something I've been meaning to tell you, she began hesitantly. I don't know why, but it always seems to slip my mind. That night that I left you early, the night you saw the colored disc, when I got to Route 2 and started for Point Pleasant, I saw a big globe of light on the river. I couldn't figure out what it was, but I didn't stop. The funny thing is, I forgot it completely. I didn't remember it until a day or so afterward, then I forgot it again. I can't understand it. I've always had a good memory. Lacunal amnesia, loss of the memory of specific incidents or moments in time, is a common part of the phenomenon. In December 1967, Faye Carpenter, Connie's mother, had a more baffling attack of amnesia. The night that Jack Brown visited Connie, so this is referring to the Men in Black, Mrs. Carpenter had opened the door for him. He was in a shirt sleeves, no jacket or coat, although it was extremely cold. She was not going to let him in, but she did, and she had absolutely no memory of his visit afterward, even though she had been present when he talked with Connie, Keith, and Larry. In the days following Mr. Brown's visit, a poltergeist settled in the Carpenter household. Securely fastened pictures fell off the walls, small objects disappeared from shelves and reappeared in unlikely places. The manifestations lasted about 2 weeks. Okay, so these are the main UFO sightings from John Keele, Mary Hyre. Absolutely bizarre, as you can tell. What is going on in that valley? I mean, it's just some of the strangest ever. It's a shame he didn't film them. He brought his film camera, or maybe he did film them and didn't release the footage for whatever reason. But it seems like he was kind of mesmerized by the lights, or he could have also amnesia that he doesn't know about and cited even more, but that's what he remembered. So, very, very strange. Is this more strange than the Mothman? I don't know. They're both pretty crazy, but these are incidents where these lights or objects were viewed for relatively long periods of time by many people, but only in this window of time. How come nobody's seeing them a couple years later, a couple years earlier? You know, that's something you really need to think about. But was that the end of the UFO activity in West Virginia? No, it was not. There is more. John Keel writes, James Lilly stood on his lawn surrounded by reporters from Charleston and Huntington newspapers, Sheriff George Johnson and his wife and a host of others. Hundreds of automobiles lined the Camp Conley Road, dark and silent except for the glows of cigarettes. Other cars cruised in slow streams along the rutted roads of the TNT area to the north. It's just about that time, Jim Lilly announced, glancing at his watch. It was exactly 8:30 p.m. They come over every night right about now. Horns suddenly began to bleat and excited shouts echoed through the trees. Right on time, Lily chuckled. You can set your watch by 'em. My God, what is it? A reporter and novice UFO watcher cried out as a brilliant white light slowly glided into view. It arched gracefully overhead about 100 feet above the trees. Car doors slammed up and down the road as families scrambled out of their vehicles to watch. Newsmen floundered with the expensive cameras. What in the hell is the matter with this? The shutter didn't trip. The light passed slowly towards Point Pleasant, the ground below lighting up in its glow as it passed. Where's that guy Keel? Someone asked. He's probably up there riding in that damn thing, someone else answered. A light plane suddenly circled over the TNT area, all its lights ablaze. Here comes Doc Shaw again, Jim Lilly laughed. Who does he think he's fooling? But voices were crying out in the dark, there goes another one. The plane cut its engine for a moment and glided. George Johnson turned to his wife. Well, you wanted to see a UFO. It was like seeing a ghost, she shuddered. The air was filled with sounds of auto engines grinding away impotently and drivers snarling and cursing because their cars wouldn't start. The light traveled onto the ravine that passed behind North Park Road. Then it dipped down and moved low along the bottom of the ravine. Betty Kelly, 13, looked out the kitchen window of the Kelly house and screamed, Ma, it's back! The glowing thing was appearing nightly behind the Kelly home. It seemed to settle in their backyard at times, and the glow phased and the glow faded slightly so they could see a definite object. They even thought they saw a triangular doorway in it and what appeared to be frosted glass windows. Their neighbors had all been watching too, but had wisely avoided publicity. They didn't want their street to become another Camp Conley Road or TNT area. When Betty cried out, Bill Kelly, her father, grumbled in the living room. He was an electronics engineer and he had just taken the back off the family's brand new color TV set. The set had blown out the night before when the object had paid a visit. Somebody should do something about these things, he complained. The object began to glow more intensely and then it vanished. Where did it go? Mrs. Kelly asked her daughter. I don't know. It just went. She started to cry. She would be so nervous and upset that she wouldn't go to school the next day. The phone rang. Bill Kelly looked at it as if it were a snake. He picked it up slowly, listened, and scowled, then replaced the receiver. His wife glanced at him expectantly. Another one of those calls. A beep, beep, beep. He nodded. On top of a hill, east of Point Pleasant, Mary Hyre and I stood by our cars looking down at the village. Where did it go, John? I was straining my eyesight through a cheap telescope. I think it went down that ravine by North Park, but I can't see it now. At least it was right on schedule. Flickering red and green lights suddenly appeared. A plane, I noted. Probably Dr. Shaw. He had told me he's been spooking the people at the TNT area. It's hard to mistake an airplane for one of those UFO lights. Look, she called out sharply. Something is following that plane. A few hundred feet behind the plane, I could see a large black object almost as big as the plane itself, but completely without lights. Mothman. Is it Mothman? I fumbled with my telescope. It's very difficult to zero in on an object in the night sky with a handheld telescope. I couldn't even locate the plane. The plane crossed a river and headed for the Kallipolis airport. The thing following him was quickly lost in the black sky. We returned to Mary's office and found all the phones ringing. People were seeing flying objects all up and down the valley. Some had probably just seen the good doctor's nocturnal sortie, but others described what sounded like genuine UFOs. That was April 5th, 1967, a Wednesday. I had collected and analyzed some 700 UFO reports from 1966. 700, wow. And discovered that the greatest number of sightings, 20%, took place on Wednesdays. I called this the Wednesday phenomena. The events of 1967 conformed to this curious pattern, as have the sightings of later flaps. The major events of October 1973 were concentrated around Wednesdays, particularly Wednesday, October 17th. So here was another curious contradiction. The entities professed to be ignorant of our time frame, yet the objects managed to fly to a rigid schedule that could be measured by our clocks and calendars. When I interviewed attorney Robert Wright in Sistersville, West Virginia, he told me the things had turned up every Wednesday throughout the summer of 1966 like clockwork. No one except the U.S. Air Force had attempted even a superficial statistical analysis of UFO sightings before, so my findings were greeted with howls of derision by the scientists who posed as experts on this phenomenon. Then Dr. David Saunders of Colorado University fed several thousand sightings into a computer and found the Wednesday phenomenon remained stable. That day produced the largest number of sightings, well beyond the laws of chance and averages. Okay, so what do we have here? Okay, John Keel, once again, connects dots in an incredible way. So Wednesdays, exactly on time, every Wednesday night throughout the summer, some witnesses report. This is clearly well beyond something that can be explained by mass hysteria or a sandhill crane or an owl. Well beyond. So what is Wednesday? So Wednesday is of course derived from Woden's Day or Odin's Day. It is the day of Mercury or Hermes, the messenger of the gods, Roman god of commerce, travel, and science. Woden was the ruler of Asgard and is able to shift and change into different forms. Also, Wednesday is associated with communication. Messengers, communication, these are the themes. Wednesday is also the day the sun and moon were created according to the Hebrew Bible. Very interesting. So UFO phenomenon are apparently scheduled on Wednesdays. Wednesday, a day of the week associated with the messenger of the gods and travel and communication. The color purple is also associated with this day. So these are all, of course, just more and more coincidences. I gather. Those who explain all these coincidences away as coincidences, I don't think they're thinking critically, because this is quite a few coincidences stacked on top of each other. I mean, it's just absolute mind-shocking insanity. But we're still not at the end of it. There is more. John Keele writes, in March 1967, Ralph Jarrett talked me into violating my low-profile policy, and I appeared with him on the Jackie Oberlinger show on WCHS-TV in Charleston. In the course of our discussion, I mentioned that the best time to see a UFO was 10 p.m. on a Wednesday. Mrs. Oberlinger, a vivacious blonde lady and very much a local celebrity, took me at my word. On Wednesday, March 29th, she and a group of her friends gathered at her backyard in Charleston, and sure enough, at exactly 10 p.m., 3 globes of brilliant white light passed directly overhead in a V formation. The Wednesday phenomenon works. I've been studying it for years, and I still can't say why it works. Researchers in other parts of the world have now followed my example and found similar time patterns in the sightings of their own countries. Soon after arriving in Point Pleasant and getting a handle on the scope of the situation, I phoned the Lockburn Air Force Base in Ohio and outlined what was happening to a Lieutenant Hoffman, the base UFO officer. He was very polite, but he was also disinterested, and it was clear the Air Force was not going to launch any kind of investigation. Perhaps an investigation was already underway. As I wandered around Main Street in early April, I noticed a surprising number of strangers who just didn't seem to fit in. They had the indelible look of federal officers. Conservative ties, square clothes, recent haircuts. There must have been 15 or 20 of them. I saw them in the local restaurants and drugstores everywhere. Is there a convention in town? I asked Mary Hyre. So you noticed them too, she smiled. Everybody's been asking me about them, but so far I haven't found out a thing. I decided to trap one of them into a conversation, but they all vanished before I could do so. One night, Roger Scarberry, Steve Mallett, and myself were driving around the TNT area when we came upon a large Cadillac parked in the shadows. I slammed on the brakes, got out of our car, and walked over to the other vehicle. A well-dressed, distinguished-looking man was sitting behind the wheel holding a microphone in his hand. I tried to engage him in a conversation, but he would only grunt. Obviously, he wanted to be left alone. I never saw him again. My days were spent tracking down witnesses, and in early evening I would cruise through the TNT area before going to 5 Mile Creek Road for skywatches that usually lasted until 3 or 4 a.m. Then I would drive back to Point Pleasant across the rickety old Silver Bridge into Ohio and grab a few hours sleep at the Blue Fountain. 3 or 4 miles south of my secret hilltop, there was a heavily forested ridge. The object with the reddish window, which Mary and I had seen on our first night, seemed to have come from there. Each night at exactly 10 p.m., a bright red glow would appear on that ridge as if someone had just turned on a powerful light. Thinking there might be a house there or a road, and we were watching auto taillights, I returned in daylight but found it would have been a very long hike to reach it. No buildings were visible there. I drove through the roads in the Chief Cornstalk Hunter Grounds, hoping to find a road up that particular ridge, but apparently it was inaccessible. On Thursday, April 6th, Mrs. Hyre accompanied me to 5 Mile Creek Road, and we watched as the light came on, right on schedule. Suddenly, we saw an identical type light behind the trees north of our position in the very spot where I had seen the glowing disc descend. I knew there were no houses or roads in that direction. We divided our attention between the two lights. Both seemed to be moving through the trees very slowly. I got out of the car with my flashlight and flashed it 3 times in the direction of the southern ridge. An instant later, there were 3 extremely bright flashes. Mary nearly jumped out of her skin. "They answered you," she declared. The red light rose upward until it was 100 feet or so above the trees. Then it went out as if someone had turned off a switch. Then the light in the north dipped down behind the trees and disappeared. So they signed an affidavit to this. They wanted it legit. They wanted everybody to know they weren't making this up. This is the affidavit. To whom it may concern, I, Mrs. Hyre, of 219 6th Street, Point Pleasant, West Virginia, a reporter for the Athens, Ohio Messenger, hereby swear that I was present at the following event and personally witnessed it as described. On the evening of April 6, 1967, I accompanied Mr. John A. Keele of New York City to an isolated hilltop on 5 Mile Creek Road south of Gallipolis Ferry, West Virginia. Shortly after 11 p.m., I observed a pale red object of undetermined size moving in a controlled manner slightly above a treetop level over a hill about 500 yards south of our position. There are no houses or roads on that hill. The object appeared to move cautiously and slowly through the sky to the far end of the sloping field. The light flickered on and off in an irregular pattern. As the object drew closer, Mr. Keele got out of the car and flashed a powerful flashlight directly at it 3 times. The object immediately returned the signal by flashing a brilliant white light 3 times. Then it rose upward, and the pale red light went out completely. And this was done in front of a notary, June 12, 1977. On this day, personally appeared before me in my office, county and state, Mary Hyre, known to me personally, and acknowledged the above statement to be true, and that she personally signed her signature in my presence. Given under my hand this 21st day of June 1967, my commission expires. Wow. Okay, what... This sighting is insane. It's basically an encounter where the UFOs are returning light flashes to what John Keele flashed. And in other cases, he was doing some kind of Morse code and instructing the UFOs to descend, and they were interacting with him. So how bizarre is all this? This is one of the most well-respected ufologists conducting these experiments and investigations into the UFO phenomenon in Point Pleasant, West Virginia. I mean, the Mothman almost takes a back seat to this level of phenomenon. It's really, really insane. So unless he's lying about all this, and he got Mary Hyre in the lie with him, this well-respected journalist, and they got all these other people in with him, people who trust each other, like, do they have nothing better to do than to screw around like this? I mean, clearly something is going on. And once again, there's plenty more. Mrs. Mabel McDaniel and 2 other women went to the hill with me the following night. About 10:15, the usual reddish glow appeared on the southern hill. Then a second one popped up a short distance from the first. I flashed my light at them, but nothing happened. So I climbed a fence and walked into a field to try to get closer look. The 2 objects slowly came together. As I crossed the field, I suddenly noticed something new. A pale bluish ball of light hovering high in the trees of an orchard behind the nearby farmhouse. The light moved about from tree to tree as though it were following my movements. I flashed my light at it, and it flared with dazzling brilliance, dimmed, and vanished. Simultaneously, the lights on the southern ridge grew brighter for a moment, then also went out. I slowly made my way back across the field in the dark, climbed the fence, and returned to Mrs. McDaniel's car. I was surprised to find all 3 women in a frightened state. "I think we'd better leave," Mrs. McDaniel said nervously. They drove off quickly. 5 minutes later, as I sat alone in my car, the reddish glow flared up again on the ridge. For the first time, it changed color from red to a glaring white and rose slowly upward, bobbing like a yo-yo toward the river in the west. Apparently, some boatmen on the river saw the object also, for a bright searchlight suddenly shot up from behind the hills, aimed directly at the luminous thing. When the searchlight appeared, the object halted in mid-flight, dropped downward, and went out. The searchlight continued to scan the sky. The next day, I talked with Mrs. McDaniel and told her what I had seen. "Too bad you didn't stick around," I remarked. "We were pretty scared," she began. You'll probably think we were being silly. "Did that blue light frighten you?" "It wasn't the light," she said hesitantly. "We saw that, and then we saw a tall man in the field. We all saw him climb over the fence and cross behind our car. We thought it was you coming back. Then your flashlight went on way out in the field, and we knew it wasn't you. We ran the windows up and locked the doors and waited for you to come back." I had certainly not seen anyone else in the field. Had their eyes been playing tricks, or were there phantoms on the hilltop? That weekend, I drove into Ohio to check out some of the many weird events happening there. One of my all-time favorites happened in the little village of Duncan Falls. Here is the verbatim entry from my journal. Sometime in late October 1966, a witness does not remember exact date, Mr. Leonard Shy Elmore, 72, Duncan Falls, Ohio, was taking a stroll around 4 a.m. when he encountered a strange building which frightened him badly. Like many elderly people, Mr. Elmore does not sleep well and often takes long walks late at night. On this particular morning, he was walking along a road 2 blocks from his home when he saw a strange L-shaped building that looked like a galvanized iron shed sitting in the middle of a large field. Since he had never noticed this shed before, he walked closer to take a better look. Something about it frightened him. Later, he could not explain why it had scared him, and he turned and started to hurry away. Although it was dark and he could see no windows or doors in the shed, he claimed that he distinctly heard a normal male voice come from it. "Don't run. Don't run," the voice called. "I didn't exactly run," Mr. Elmore told me, "but I walked pretty fast." He hurried home, got his rifle, and returned to the site. To his astonishment, the shed was gone. This incident upset him very much, and according to his wife, he was a nervous wreck for several days afterwards. He decided to call the sheriff and report what he'd seen. The sheriff promised to come out and take a look, but never did. Mr. Elmore told me his story in a direct manner without embellishment or wandering speculations. No men in black came around to bother Mr. Elmore. I was the first reporter to talk to him. When he showed me the field, I was perturbed to find that it was right next to the Duncan Falls Elementary School. An unusual number of sightings and 14 events seem to be concentrated around schools, and the largest percentage of witnesses consist of children between the ages of 7 and 18. Another statistical oddity is that the majority of adults who claim their autos were pursued by UFOs or monsters are school teachers, especially teachers specializing in abnormal children, the very bright or the mentally deficient. This is why I was so interested in the West Virginia census takers, who were mainly concerned with the numbers and ages of children living in the Ohio Valley. Covered that in the previous episode on the Men in Black. So, moving on. I mean, that's a really bizarre incident, of which, once again, there are many. These people have basically no advantage in coming forward with their story. I mean, unless they want to be viewed as crackpots or just insane people that are easily scared. So, obviously, things probably happen similar, or they believe things happen similar to what they reported, whether they did or they didn't. So, we've gone through all of these different types of phenomena, but were there crop circles in Point Pleasant during the Mothman encounters in addition to UFO, Men in Black, and poltergeist activity? Well, if you guessed yes, you guessed correctly, because we are not done here with the amount of phenomenon in this case. So, the next incident is one of the most bizarre crop circle cases and is not talked about for some reason in the midst of the Mothman lore, like some of these most interesting accounts and encounters, which are, for whatever reason, not really well known. But it is truly mind-shocking as well. John Keele is a smart man using smart tactics. Clearly he was being watched during his investigations and interviews of witnesses in West Virginia. He describes this as such. Someone, somewhere, obviously knew every move I was making, or so it seemed. I became very secretive, not even telling my closest friends where I was going or where I had been. Nevertheless, something seemed to be following me. I would drop in unannounced on a remote farm, and soon after I settled down to chat with the residents, their phone would ring and there would be no one on the line. Or a series of loud beeps would ring out. The farmer would act astonished. We've never had a call like that before. The phone would ring repeatedly until I left. This happened several different times in several different places. I used a system of spot checks, visiting homes in flap areas and talking with people who had never reported anything. Mrs. Hyre accompanied me on a number of these spot checks and was amazed at how much had been going on. Her name and face were familiar to everyone in the area, and her reputation as a fair, objective reporter was impeccable. People automatically loosened up when they saw her and talked freely. In the hills surrounding Point Pleasant, we heard many stories about footsteps on the roof, strange metallic clangings, the most common being the sound of a car door slamming outside the house when there were no cars in sight. One family showed us how the flap covering the entrances to their attic had been mysteriously moved. It was a hole in the ceiling of a bedroom and could only be reached with a high ladder. Others complained of gypsies marching across their property late at night, men in bright reflecting clothing and women in ankle-length dresses, all with long hair and dark oriental faces. This was well before the hippie explosion of the late 1960s. North of Gallipolis, Ohio, I impulsively stopped at an isolated farmhouse one afternoon, and when I knocked at the door, a grim-faced man answered with a shotgun in his hands. I started to show my credentials and explained who I was, but he cut me short. "I know who you are," he growled. "We don't want anything to do with you. Get out of here." Puzzled, I reported back to Mary and suggested that she visit the farm to see if she could find out the reason for the man's strange behavior. The next day we went back. I remained in the car while she talked with him for several minutes. Finally, they both came out to the car laughing. "You're not going to believe this," the farmer began apologetically, "but 10 minutes before you arrived here yesterday, I got a phone call. It sounded like a neighbor of mine, and he said he was calling to warn me about a crazy man, a real dangerous type with a beard, that had just been to see him. Said I shouldn't have anything to do with him. 10 minutes later, you showed up. After you left, I called him back. He was out in the fields, had been all day. His wife had to go get him. He said he hadn't made that call." I looked sternly at Mary. "Is this some kind of put-on?" "Absolutely not," she answered, turning to the farmer. "Tell him the rest of it." "Well, about a week ago, something scared my cows real bad," he continued. "You know, we ain't told anyone about this, Mrs. Hyre. You aren't going to put it in the paper, are you?" "Not if you don't want us to." "Come on, let me show you something." He led us into the field behind his barn. There was a 30-foot circle of scorched earth on the hillside. I had seen several of these fairy circles before. "That night our cows really acted up," he went on. "They stampeded. They were so scared they went right through the fence over there." He pointed toward a stretch of wire fence that had obviously just been repaired. "It's an electric fence. Now, you know that it takes a lot to make cows charge through an electric fence. Anyway, when I heard the ruckus, I ran outside and saw my cows scattering down the road, and there was a big red and white glowing thing sitting right in the field. I've got to say that it scared me half to death. I ran back into my house to get my gun. Didn't take me more than a minute, but when I got outside again, the thing was gone. The circle was all that was left. It took the rest of the night to round up my cows." "Were any of them lost or missing?" I asked. "No," he paused, "but Herc, that's Hercules, my big old collie dog, ran off that night, and we ain't seen him since." Mary had been with me when I had checked into the other missing dog incidents. She gave me a meaningful glance, and he caught it. "Say, you don't think the thing took old Herc, do you?" "No, it was probably just some kind of electrical phenomenon," I answered gently. "Herc will probably come back." "I hope so. We sure loved that dog." He looked thoughtful. "Electrical, huh? Let me show you something else." He led us into his barn and showed us a brand new circuit box. I had to have this put in the next day so I could run my milker. The old box was completely burned out. In fact, it was melted, like someone had put a welding torch to it. "See, it must have been some kind of electrical thing," I said lamely. I knew Ivan Sanderson had investigated an almost identical incident in New Jersey only weeks before, but in that case the cows had been in their stalls in the barn and were found dead. "Has anyone else been around to talk to you about this?" "No, I haven't told anyone, just some fellows from the electrical company who turned up the next day. They fussed around with a transformer on the pole by the road. I tried to talk with them, but they didn't have much to say." "Do you know them?" "Never saw them before. Come to think of it, they didn't have a regular electric truck, just a panel truck." "Would you recognize them if you saw them again?" "Sure would. They were foreigners, you know, Japs or something. Like I said, they weren't very friendly." "How were they dressed?" "Oh, you know, ordinary coveralls. I did notice their shoes, though. They had on funny shoes with very thick rubber soles. Guess when you work around electricity, you need insulation." Mary shuddered perceptibly. "Say, do you know these fellows?" he asked. "Well, I saw a man with thick-soled shoes like that once," Mary began. I cut in sharply, thanking the man, promising to keep him out of the papers, and reminding Mary that we had an appointment elsewhere. Back in the car, Mary could no longer curb her natural curiosity. "What do you make of all this, John? The more I find out, the more confusing it becomes." "That's the way I feel. That phone call. Sounds like someone didn't want you to talk to him." "It could work the other way, too," I suggested. "Maybe this whole thing was a setup so I would talk to him. I just picked his farm out at random. If he had just turned me away with a smile, I would have never bothered him again, but when he came to the door with a gun..." "But how did they know you were going to stop there? How could anyone have possibly known?" That's the real question. How could anyone have known? As if that's not bizarre enough, the intense strangeness continues, and Keele drops some really interesting connections next. Not that the previous ones weren't interesting, but there is more weirdness afoot. A few days before leaving New York, I called Gray Barker in Clarksburg, and he agreed to meet me the following Tuesday in Point Pleasant. As soon as he hung up, I dialed Woodrow Derenberger's unlisted number and spoke to his wife. "When are you coming to see us again?" she asked. "I expect to be in West Virginia next week," I replied. "I know. I hear you're having a secret meeting with Gray Barker on Tuesday." I was stunned. "A meeting with Gray," I admitted, "but it's not very secret. I didn't know about it myself until a couple of minutes ago. How on earth did you know?" There was a pause. "Charlie Cutler over in Ohio told us about it a couple of days ago," she finally said. "And how did he know about it?" I don't know. I suppose he heard it somewhere." When you enter the unreal world of contactees, predictions, prophecies, and a mysterious invasion of your privacy becomes commonplace. Contactees seem to develop heightened perceptions, ESP, and precognition. The changes occur almost overnight. In their meetings with the entities, they are served up platters of propaganda along with rumors and nonsense which they accept and repeat as facts. Many of the choicest tidbits in UFO lore were not actual events, but were put into circulation by contactees who had placed their complete trust in their contactors. The entities spun wild tales about crashed saucers being confiscated by the U.S. Air Force, farmers shooting and wounding spacemen, and so forth. Contactees repeated the stories to wild-eyed UFO enthusiasts, and so they spread in ever-widening circles until they appeared in articles and books. So, very, very strange, especially with the crop circle situation, the electrical van with those people. I mean, the links between the Men in Black and the possible alien astronauts or interdimensional entities or whatever, these things masquerading as humans. There seem to be a lot of them, and there's all these repeat incidents, from like guys looking at the gas lines in those UFOs to this incident here to plenty others. Clearly, there was something very, very strange going on. So it really seems like all the Men in Black and UFO activity really overshadowed the Mothman sightings. Why this is all swept aside and only the Mothman is focused on seems very strange. One of the most mysterious, most witnessed, including many credible witnesses and police officers, UFO researchers, UFO waves ever occurred in the Point Pleasant area over the course of 1966 and 1967. There is clearly enough evidence here to warrant serious investigations, perhaps more so than into the flying humanoid, although that definitely deserves its fair share, and is the main focal point of this podcast series. However, all of this does seem to be connected. Whether simply a vortex of paranormal happenstances, or a part of a greater web of events that actually has been going on since the beginning of mankind, and continues to do so behind the regular veil most of us can see, it is clear that strange events really did occur. Before we attempt to decipher the entire mystery, we will delve into another overlooked aspect of the Mothman lore: the poltergeist activity associated with witnesses and other people living in the Point Pleasant area. Thank you for joining us for another edition of the MINDSHOCK podcast. If you like the podcast, you can donate to our PayPal. Just check the link in the description. Until next time, this is Bruce McGuire, signing off.